And the filmmakers join us now, Bill Killon and Tom Henry. It's good to see you again. Welcome.
Good to see you, Tom.
And we say again because we aired your first film here on Mountain Lake PBS about Verplanck Colvin, the famed Adirondack surveyor. So we're now here talking about your newest film called When I Come Home, and it tells the story of a young soldier killed in Vietnam and the rather unusual memorial that his community has preserved all these years in his memory.
Okay, all good up here anytime.
We caught up with you while you were filming on a beautiful fall day, shooting scenes using a vintage car slowly cruising the streets of Port Henry below. And the car you used almost identical to one owned by Marcus Stoddard, who worked as a mechanic at Henry's Garage in Port Henry. Tom, that was your grandfather's garage.
That was my great-grandparents' garage.
Great-grandparents.
That's right. And then grandparents, and then it stayed in the family until 1969 when Mark worked there. And Mark was a car guy. That Pontiac you're talking about, he had a Pontiac just like that. And he was a kind of a puzzle guy. He liked to figure out how things worked. He taught himself auto mechanics. He taught himself how to shoot guns and how to repair guns. And by the time he graduated high school, he had had quite a few cars, and he was well qualified to take a job at Henry's Garage. And that's where he worked when he enlisted in the Marines and eventually deployed to Vietnam. And before leaving for Vietnam, they had a little gathering and at the garage, kind of an impromptu farewell. And in passing out the beers, Mark decided he would put his beer in the rafters to drink when he came home. And that's where the title of the movie came from.
This was a little impromptu send-off.
Yes.
And they gathered, and instead of drinking the beer, just on a whim, he decided to put it up on the rafter in the back of the garage.
He did. That little act of putting that can up there, that, as unlikely as it seems, the can remained there 50 years. But that catapulted his story 50 years to today, where we're telling his story and looking into what he left, his mementos, his letters, learning about Mark. And we're finding in the letters wonderful descriptions of his time in Vietnam. Only 2 months before he was killed. But in that 2 months, he went over there gung-ho, found himself in Operation Dewey Canyon, which was probably the most tactically successful air-ground operation of the whole war. He was initially very impressed with that war and the management of the war. But after that operation ended, he survived that operation. He was deployed to a different area, not too far away, but then he was seeing mismanagement and a whole other side of the war. Mm. And as he's figuring that out, he's writing it down, sending his thoughts home to his family in these letters, which they've saved and shared with us. And so just in that 2 months, he figured out Vietnam, he wrote it down. Unfortunately, he didn't survive it. He didn't expect to survive it, from what we understand. He came to the same conclusions in his letters that historians 50 years later are coming to now.
And his family had saved those letters, Bill.
Yes.
And as a filmmaker, that is how you were able to tell the story. You were able to use his words from Vietnam, what he was experiencing over there and what he was thinking.
Right, and not just letters, but they saved everything. There's photographs, which is that when you're putting the film together, to have the photographs to use and not have to source them from other places. They're all in one cedar chest. And Mark's brother Mike, he had them all, and which is just really amazing, along with his Purple Heart and other medals, and they just allowed us to use all that for the film, which is great.
And you used his nephew.
We had to have someone read the letters, so we thought who better than his nephew would be the closest in relation, I guess, other than his brother, to read them. They grew up in the same town, so the way they speak would probably be pretty close. And Brian, his nephew, did an incredible job.
You also had another actress voice Marcus's girlfriend at the time, Patty.
Yes, my daughter Amy Henry, voiced Patty. And Patty wrote the words herself. She worked with us over about a 2-year period, just sending memories back and forth by email. And very good writer, and very attuned to the times, and attuned to the aftermath. And unfortunately, the town of Moriah lost 5. Statistically, a town that size would lose 1 point something. I hate to put it that way, but I'm not sure why so many from Moriah, but maybe it's because more stepped up. It was a hard hit for that town. Patty and Mike, Mark's brother Mike, were both very willing to share that. As Mike has said, he's had years and years to contemplate all of this and get it straight in his mind, and same with Patty. And they were ready to share the story and in detail. And that helped us to tell the story. And I think the story is powerful mostly because of the input from the family and the friends.
As the years went by, some of the stories were forgotten, and it was actually your cousin Debbie who was at the garage a few years ago. The Henry's garage turned into the fire station in the early 70s, and there was an effort underway to declare it a National Historic Landmark, to put it on the National Register of Historic Places. And so there was a site visit happening, and she mentioned that folks gathered there, and that's when the story sort of came back to life about, oh, there was this young mechanic who went off to war and left this beer can on the rafter in the back of the garage, or in the garage somewhere.
As we met to do the tour for the National Register, that's when Debbie had this recollection. She had not been inside the garage since she was 14 years old. And she remembered her mother telling her the story about this beer can, Mark putting it up in the rafters. And she just looked at me in a parking lot and said, she calls me Tommy. Tommy, do you think that beer can is still? She assumed I remembered or knew about it. I didn't know what she was talking about. And it took a while for me to grasp what she was saying, but then more and more people came into the circle, and we were just intrigued that this could still be in there. And of course, some of the old timers knew about the can, but they just, the story hadn't really been passed down. It was mostly forgotten. So we're going through the building, 4-story building, up on the roof, down through the stalls, and the electricity is off in most areas. We've got cell phones, flashlights. We're supposed to be looking at architectural features. We're looking for the beer can. And we get almost all the way through the building, down to the cellar, come back to the main floor, and then all of a sudden we find the can. And at that point we hadn't expected to see it. And then, of course, that leads into following up on the story, contacting Mark's brother Mike, and eventually coming in touch with David Blaze, who is the last surviving member of that gathering when Mark put the can up there. And David was able to fill in all the gaps in the story for us.
There were firefighters who knew the story and had told others not to disturb that can.
Right, and that was true mostly going back 50 years, where, now very few people, or, when we found the can, very few people knew about it then. But for the first 10 years or so, a lot of people knew about it, and they did protect the can. And it's still sitting there today.
The film includes a soundtrack. This is an original soundtrack by 2 of your friends. You played with these gentlemen in a band over just across the lake in Vermont.
Yes.
Mark Wetmiller and Mark Bouchette.
Mark and Mark are a songwriting team in Vermont, and I'm not part of the songwriting team, but I do step in and play piano tracks and keyboard tracks with the band. But they're the songwriters, and we were working on an album, and one song in particular just struck me as, well, this would be a very nice theme for this movie, and I hadn't even mentioned this movie to them. It was already underway. So I asked if they would consider rewriting the lyrics and letting us use that tune. And then they started showing me some other material that they had, and we found a whole soundtrack.
You know, when you're making a film like this, the hardest part for me is finding music, because you normally go into like stock music sites to source things, and to have something that's so cohesive and, you know, perfectly made for what the story we're trying to tell. That was, you know, that's like 50% of the work for me.
You have a screening scheduled. This will be the premiere. Mm-hmm. It's coming up next week, next Thursday night, the 21st, in Moriah. It's going to be at the high school, in the auditorium there. And this will be the first time that you've shown the film in public, and you're inviting family members and community members to come and experience this. Marcus's brother, his nephew, who voiced him in the movie, they're coming and going to participate in this, and then have a discussion at the end, or a Q&A with the audience, because really this movie it's about Marcus's story. It's about the amazing memorial, unusual, that was left to him, but it's also about what, as you mentioned earlier, what this community has gone through, losing 5 young men to the Vietnam War.
The whole community turned out for Mark's funeral in April of '69, which is 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And Mark, you know, putting that beer can in that garage, and that's like a calling card that the community is coming together again to answer that calling card at this screening 50 years later. It's a tribute more than a movie, I think, but that's how we view it, as a tribute.
The premiere of Tom and Bill's documentary, When I Come Home, will be held this coming Thursday, February 21st at 6:30 at the Moriah High School Auditorium. It is free and open to everyone. And When I Come Home will be broadcast this coming Memorial Day weekend here on Mountain Lake PBS. Also, you can watch our story on the filming of the documentary that aired here on Mountain Lake Journal in the fall of 2017. You'll find it online at mountainlake.org. And while there, you can also visit our Veterans Coming Home page for stories on how our nation and communities are remembering our fallen servicemen and women and honoring and caring for our veterans who returned home from Vietnam. You'll find dozens of stories on our website at mountainlake.org.